This is Sam Long.
I'm Ron Peters.
And I'm John Nugent.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class.
Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of the After Class Podcast. We took a week off last week and got to spend some time with our former students, some alumni, and so that was really good, and I hope you enjoyed that. But today we're going to get back on track with the conversation that's been going for a week now that's kind of morphed away from our original intention. We were working our way through the early parts of John's endangered gospel, and in the process of that, took it upon ourselves to begin telling the story of the Bible. And we've really gotten into that, I think, more so than we originally intended. But I think we're having a good time doing it, and I hope that you all are getting a lot out of it. And so we just want to continue doing that. We want to pick up where we left off before we took our break last week and continue telling that story. So today we're going to get into Genesis chapter 6 and talk about this really, really fun, fascinating topic of the sons of God and the daughters of men. So to start off with that, I think I'll go ahead and read that. I think that's what we agreed on, right, guys?
Yep, go for it.
All right, so we'll read the passage, and then you two Old Testament guys can really lead us in that conversation. So Genesis chapter 6, beginning in verse 1, reads thus: When people began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide with mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of their hearts. Oh, I thought you guys said verses 1 through 6.
No, 1 through 4.
1 through 4.
Chapter
All
6.
right. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Okay, my bad. I thought we were going all
We'll
the way
let it
six.
out.
So, yeah, the knife across the throat thing was not lost on me. So sorry about that. So verses 1 through 4, the sons of God and the daughters of men.
And the big controversy about this passage is who are the sons of God and who are the daughters of men.
Right.
And there have been kind of classic theories, or the most common theories that people use to interpret these. One is that sons of God are angels, or junior gods or junior deities who have come down to the earth and taken for themselves human daughters. So, and that those having come together in some form of intercourse, however angels and humans can have intercourse, resulted in the Nephilim to be kind of hybrid offspring, half angel, half human.
Kind of demigod kind of a thing.
So that's one theory. Another is what I call the poser theory, that at least there are some people who are posing as demigods. They're humans that think they're deities or pretending to be deities, who are using their divine privilege and taking ordinary human women from lower class people and who are more susceptible and having children with them. And those children then become posers to be in these hybrid, supernatural kind of people, right?
You know, it's funny because I don't think that that's something that's exclusive to the ancient world. You know, maybe people might not be claiming to be gods in this age, but certainly see people act almost like with godlike aspirations, that they feel like, hey, there's something about me and my wealth or power or status that elevates me above, the people around me. In fact, now that I'm talking it out, it almost makes me think of that the Harvey Weinstein thing. I mean, is there something in his sense of his like power and wealth that made him feel like he had a right to, abuse, even sexually abuse all these different women? Is there a mindset in that kind of a person who has that kind of power and wealth that is in any way maybe similar to the posers you're talking about in the Old Testament? Is there something there, or am I just going off on a weird kind of a tangent?
Yep.
Yes.
I always leave it for Sam to say that. Ron puts the bizarre theory out there. I look to Sam. He says, "Yep."
I mean, I don't buy the poser theory as the best appropriation of this passage anyway, but I see what you're saying. The idea of, someone thinks more of themselves, extends their power and authority over people. I mean, that's just the nature of humans.
I mean, that's like Gilgamesh.
That's what people do. And, Weinstein being an example, then you become bigger than anything, bigger than the law, bigger than Hollywood, whatever it is. I'm this person. I can do what I want.
Yeah.
So, that happens in the world. I'm not sure that's what's happening here.
Okay, fair enough. It just, as you were saying that, John, that kind of popped into my head is maybe a modern day example of somebody who has that kind of an attitude without necessarily claiming to be a god per se.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. And people sure act like they're superhuman and they can do what they please.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, another interpretation is that we're talking about ordinary humans from Seth's lineage. So, out of Abraham's children, Abel, of course, died early, and Seth...
You mean Adam's children?
I said Abraham, didn't I?
You did. That's fine.
Rewind. Out of Adam's children, Cain represents kind of an evil line, and Seth represents the good line because it's through Seth that you're going to get Noah, and eventually Abraham, and eventually Jesus, right? So Seth's lineage is the godly lineage, and so some say that the sons of God were the descendants of the godly line, and the daughters of men were the descendants of the, fallen human line of Cain. Mm-hmm. And so that when godly people interbreed with ungodly people, then you have like hybrid people who aren't fully godly. And then so the offspring are tainted by that illicit union.
Redheads.
That's for you, Galen.
That's for Galen.
Galen's a student with a beautiful
He really likes
lock.
our podcast and wants to be in. He wants to watch. He wanted to be here live, and I said, no, we don't do that.
Yeah, we don't do that. But now you've been mentioned by name, Galen, so
there you go.
A little love towards you.
Yeah, whose hair is just about as long as Ron, but instead of being long and silver, it is red.
Yes,
it is.
Blondish red. Yeah.
A standout freshman. Maybe someday we'll be on this podcast.
Yeah, we'll see.
And a fourth theory is that the sons of God were nobility. That is, and this one's kind of similar to the poser one in that often ancient nobility thought themselves to be divine. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to look, any further than ancient Egypt, where a pharaoh thought he was a special divine status, and that gave him rights. Mm-hmm. And so divine people or royal people who claim divine power then choose women for themselves, and so like raid the commoners' villages for women that they want and build these harems.
Yeah.
And then the offspring, there's nothing special about the offspring, but the Nephilim, the giant men, are the warrior class that the kings surround themselves with. And so that's another theory. So those are the four most common ones. In a little bit, I'll share some of the more off-the-wall, more recent ones. Mm-hmm. But some initial thoughts. I know Sam's been wanting to kind of weigh in on. What's your theory, Sam? We've got four here. What do you got?
They're terrible. Well, as you described them. You described them well, but I think as they're presented, it's not where I go with. So let me first set the stage by saying that Genesis 1 through 11 has a lot of etiologies, a lot of stories that describe why things are the way they are.
I thought etiology was like etiology, go home, phone home.
So,
study of 80s aliens.
Yes.
Right.
So all cultures have them, and they're just like, they're things we talk about that help explain things. So, for example, when small children come to their parents and say, where do babies come from? They don't talk about reproduction. What do they say? The storks brought the baby. So if you ever seen Dumbo the cartoon, right? Storks are dropping babies everywhere. That's an etiology of where things come from and their explanations. Now, that's, obviously made up and so forth, but cultures have these ideas of whatever, because they have questions. They want to know why things are the way they are. So even Genesis 3 contains etiology. People ask the question, why is work so hard? Why do snakes crawl on the ground? That's kind of weird. Why do women suffer so much when they have children? Like, that story also goes to answer those questions. Mm-hmm. But for me, it's a dual thing. It's also being folded into this story that's working its way out. And so for me, Genesis 6, 1-4 is etiological in nature. That began as a story that was answering a specific question. And the question is, where the heck did these huge people come from? Because, I mean, imagine being, in 3000, 2000 BC, you're approximately 6 foot tall, and Shaquille O'Neal comes walking down the street. Now, we're used to it because we grew up in the culture of basketball and all the rest. But, I mean, if you've ever been by that guy, he's huge. 7 foot something, 350 pounds. He's a monster. And you do kind of wonder, how did that happen?
Yeah.
And back in that time period when they don't understand genes or anything else, when there's really large people walking among them, they're asking the question, what's the deal with this? Where do these people come from? Now, in that time period, you think more mythologically. And so you assume that the only way you're going to get a huge human is there's some divine interaction.
Yeah. He's got something more going on than, just regular
He's
mom
been
and dad.
blessed in some way by the gods.
Yeah.
And so I think that what we have here started out as an etiology of explaining why there are big people. And so it's going to contain some what we might call mythical elements that will make us uncomfortable.
Sure.
And so I'm going to go with the sons of God being demigods. And I go on that because of what I just said, but also on a semantic analysis here. In the Hebrew, it's B'nai Elohim, which is literally sons of God or sons of the gods. And if you look at comparative ancient Near Eastern literature, Ugaritic and Akkadian, this phrase is often used to talk about this divine council. Not exclusively, but more often than not, that's what it is so you have your main deity and you got the junior gods, and they all come together and they have a council and they talk about things apparently or figure things out. And so in this context,
Similar to Job.
exactly
That's
like
exactly
Job.
what I thought of, yeah.
It's the same phrasing in Job.
Yeah, B'nai Elohim.
And so, God brings his council together and let's have a conversation, guys. Now, we are uncomfortable thinking that could be other gods because we are monotheists.
Yeah.
But they weren't always monotheists.
Yeah.
That's something that takes place. Abraham was not really a monotheist. He just decided, I'm going to follow Yahweh because Yahweh's revealed himself to me. And we don't even get the name Yahweh till Exodus 3, according to the Bible.
Right.
So before we place too much backwards on the text, we understand where their mindset is and what's going on. So like Job, they come together. And so what happens when demigods have sexual relations with humans? Seemingly, you get really big humans.
Yeah.
And that's the story of Hercules
Right. Yeah.
that we're very well acquainted with.
Yeah.
Now, again, I'm sure people are out there saying, so what you're saying is the Bible is saying, well, no, what I'm saying is there's this ancient understanding, this ancient etiology that I feel is being folded into a bigger story. And we're going to get to that later. We got to get through this first. Mm-hmm. But it starts with that, there's this transgression that has happened, in my view, of the divine with the human realm. And this is continuing the storyline that has gone before. What happened in chapter 3? Humans tried to transgress this line to the divine. Why? Because they'll be like God. Mm-hmm. And we see Cain takes things like life and death upon himself, and Lamech continues that. They're doing things, they're crossing into a divine realm that they're not supposed to be. And this is kind of from the other angle. Now the, quote, divine realm is trying to interact with humanity, and it's going to end up having terrible consequences, like enacting further violence on the earth, which we'll get to. And so, all of which is to say, for me, it's a story that is very old in their history that they've held on to, this etiology that's now going to be brought in and folded in, because quite frankly, you don't have to have the first 4 verses to get into the flood account. You move on from Lamech and the death genealogy, and you could take those 4 verses out and just go right into verse 5. Yahweh saw that the wickedness of humanity was great on the earth. I mean, that seems to be the continuation of the story. But this has been dropped in as, for me, just another example of humanity and this transgression of boundaries that is taking place and causing violence in the world.
That makes me think of something in the Septuagint. That translation of Genesis 3 with the serpent, it uses the plural gods. I know in Hebrew, Elohim could be singular or plural, and it could go either way. But when the Septuagint translators came along, they translated the serpent's words to Eve as "you will be like gods," plural. And I wonder if that has adds any kind of weight to that idea that they're trying to play like gods now. And one of the next big things that you see happening is human beings getting caught up in the play of the gods. Okay, you got what you wanted. You get to be like gods. You've eaten the fruit. Now you get to be like gods. Guess what? Now you're going to play with the gods. And how's it play out? Now you got the Nephilim in the land. And now you got violence ruling the earth. You want to play like gods? Here you go. How's that working out for you?
Not so well.
Yeah. So some people have been listening along for several weeks now and saying, when are they going to disagree about something? When are we going to see the guys finally go after each other and not be on the same page? And this is a time for that.
Here you go. Ding, ding.
What I like about what Sam did there, and not everyone who takes the demigod version does, I think as well as you did, is frame it as an etiology. One of the complaints I've had against this theory of gods mating with humans and making babies is that the rest of the story doesn't seem to be about gods interfering in the human realm. It's a thing that happens. It's like one and done, and it never shows up again for the rest of the story. And, what happens to these gods? Why don't they ever come back? Like, where's the closure? Like, I know what happens to the humans; they get flooded out. But what about the gods? Like, but what you did that I found helpful and strengthens the case is say the etiology isn't really about how the gods constantly intervene on Earth, but the etiology is how to get these really tall people on the Earth, because they do show up later in the story. There are giants in the land of Canaan when the Israelites want to take it, and the Philistines tend to produce big people. We know probably because they're from Northern Europe, where they're still producing big people.
To this day, yeah.
And they've all settled on the west coast of Michigan and Holland area.
I know a few of those people.
Yeah, I'm practically in a room with two giants, really.
It's true.
But,
I'm of Northern European descent.
So, giants come back in the story, and they're play a pretty big part into the monarchy and during the conquest narrative. And so I like it because it anticipates later stuff in the narrative, which is kind of cool. The tricky part is how they come back. If they all get wiped out in the water, how are they back in the land again later? Sure. Unless there's another angel incursion on the earth.
Again, I would not use angel.
But demigod incursion.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and there's a reason for that. Because it's a perfectly good word for angel, and it's not used here. And so, I just, for me, an angel would be a different being.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, well, what I'm doing is monotheizing the account.
I understand.
Yeah.
So even though this account maybe goes back to a day where, because the Israelites didn't start out monotheistic, they had to learn.
Right. Yeah.
And so even if the account is by that, the account, in my understanding, comes together as Scripture is written as it is in a time when they are monotheistic. So the earliest Jews who received it as Scripture or had it in biblical form would have had to do something with this account to make it palatable. And so you have the Book of Enoch, right?
Yeah,
First Enoch that interprets them as being angels.
I think he ruins it.
He ruins it.
It's a great story, but he ruins.
Yeah.
To the point you're saying there, Sam. And again, a lot of this is relatively fresh to me. So I'm coming at it as just a respondent who's immediately reacting to what you say. But you talk about them taking this story from a broader sort of mythological matrix that is a part of their neighbor's mythology. Like you said, you find this similar kind of an idea of the council of the gods in, like you said, Ugaritic and Akkadian. The flood story is also a story that's not unique to the Bible. I mean, I mentioned earlier the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is far older than the Old Testament, has its own version of the flood story, where Noah's called Utnapishtim. He has to build this cube-shaped boat, which probably would never succeed, but he has to build an ark to save people. And so here again, you have Genesis taking a story that's not an Israelite story exclusively. It's part of the broader ancient Near Eastern storybook, and they essentially baptize it into their story, we might say. They say, hey, we all know this story, but I'm going to kind of give you the true account, so to speak. And if that's true of the Noah story and the flood story, I mean, to my thinking, it's a compelling argument to say this whole idea of a council of the gods, the sons of God being this sort of council of demigods. They're again drawing upon the broader Near Eastern mythology and saying, yeah, we're going to take the story that everybody knows from our neighbors, but we're going to kind of reappropriate it in some new way.
Yeah, and the question, if they're going to baptize the account, and I wouldn't use baptism language here, but circumcise the account.
There you go, much better.
Then they would, just like with the flood account, they demythologized the flood stories.
Nice little Boltman word there.
Right? I mean, it's not the account of gods who are annoyed by loud humans and, right? And, right, it's the account of, Israel's one true God.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that that account comes into the Bible and is stripped of mythological components, how did the sons of God get a free pass?
Yeah.
Where the gods make it in without being stripped, where it doesn't get stripped of the God component.
Yeah, and that's a valid point, except there are these vestiges of this mythological thinking throughout the Old Testament that have not all gotten purged. I look at Job as another possible example. For me, Deuteronomy 32 is as stark as it gets. So 32:8, it says, when the Most High, El Elyon, apportioned the nations, meaning so the implications, there's this God, he's setting up all the nations, and he's dividing humankind. He fixed the boundaries of the peoples, he's going to make, this is this group and this group and this group, according to the number of, and this is where it gets difficult, their textual variants. For you, those of you who have NIV, it's going to say according to the numbers of the Israelites.
Yep.
Which makes sense, right? God's going to portion them, that's what Joshua's all about. But there's a Dead Sea Scroll that says according to the number of the gods. And the next verse says, Yahweh's own portion was his people, Jacob his allotted share. And so it's this vestige of the implications. There's this El Elyon top god. There are the lower gods that the El Elyon is going to assign to people groups. Each nation then gets a deity. And who does Jacob/Israel get? They get Yahweh. And so it's this very interesting, it's still there.
Oh, yeah.
But the Masoretic text seemingly was very uncomfortable with it and changed it to not a portion of the number of gods, but a number of the Israelites.
Right.
And yet there's a manuscript here there that says, well, maybe originally it was this other thing. And so I think they're just these small vestiges that exist but have been sort of folded into the story in different ways. But you're completely right. You can't read Genesis 1 and not see the demythologization.
Yeah, there you go.
That sounds right. Because that's what it's doing. It's this polemic against all these other mythologies. So it is a tough thing to try to maneuver. I just say, I think it was just a story that was part of them, and they liked it, and they wanted to include it in some way, and this is how they did it. It may not be satisfactory to some people, but the Bible is this great collection of things, of sources that have come together and been pieced and woven together in a way they wanted. So, I don't know.
Yeah. The theory that I gravitate toward more is the nobility and commoners. And for similar reasons of etiology. Mm-hmm. The Israelites lived in a world where the people who cause trouble on the earth and are the source of most of the violence are the warlords, the kings, the nobility. And they had a practice of taking the daughters of commoners. And so
that is the story of Gilgamesh.
That is a story of Gilgamesh. It's a story of Abraham.
Oh, right,
where, he gets near Egypt, and what does Pharaoh do? Goes after Sarah.
Yeah, because she's a babe.
And what happens to Isaac and Rebekah? Abimelech, king in the region of the Philistines, tries to take Rebekah. And what does David do when he gets in power and becomes king? He takes Bathsheba. So there's a story of this storyline that goes on for the rest of the Bible of, things get really crazy and violent on the earth when, because of course, taking Bathsheba leads to the murder of Uriah. Yep. The punishment of that of David for that leads to the death of a lot of Israelites. And there's this connection. When people accrue power and they make themselves like kings, they take women for themselves and build harems. And that's part of the problem with the world. So it's another kind of etiology. And one of the criticisms of it is that, well, they're called sons of God. And nowhere else in the Bible do you have, like, Israel's kings called sons of God. To that I respond, yeah, this isn't portraying Israelite beliefs. Israelites aren't supposed to, first of all, have kings. And when they do, they're not supposed to take women for themselves. It's the pagan kings of the time that call themselves gods.
And sons of gods.
That, refer to themselves in that way. And this is reflecting the wider world before the creation of Israel. So how Israel referred to its own kings is irrelevant. The question is, how do other nations refer to their kings? And this was a phrase, even if the other nations aren't doing it in the Bible, they were doing it at that time period. So this could be a account of escalating human violence. Cain kills Abel, Lamech increases vengeance and violence. Now you have the rising of a warrior class on earth. And this is one of the other connections to me. The Nephilim, these giants, one of the things that kings do is surround themselves with giants.
Yeah.
I mean, David goes after Goliath, the most famous giant in the Bible. Goliath is the mighty man of the Philistines.
Yeah.
And David, when he becomes a king, surrounds himself with mighty men.
His mighty men, yeah.
Gebarim, which is the same word for mighty men that's describing the Nephilim. So this could be an account of people who, I would say kings is too, it's, that language is kind of anachronistic. But during this time, you had warlords.
Yeah, tribal chieftains, or someone who's leading people.
So it's possible that these men are starting to take commoners for themselves and surround themselves with mighty men. And as they accrue territory, they're going to run into other, warlords who are taking women in other places and surround themselves with mighty men. And when they start running into each other, they're going to start battling against each other. And who are the victims? The women, the commoners. The world is getting torn apart as proto-nations with proto-kings go against each other, and the earth gets filled with violence. That explains that the problem before the flood is this escalating human thing, which is the nature of the problem after the flood. So it's a different kind of etiology, and these two are probably two of the most common ones, right, that scholars have today. We're not going to battle it out to the death here.
Oh, I'm out.
Cage match.
But you've been exposed, I think, to two of the best ones out there.
Right. And I think what's, at least from our perspective, is we're both ending up in the same place. Even though we come at the interpretation of 1 through 4 differently, we both see how it can play into the whole point of the text, which is not where do big people come from, but why does God decide to flood the world?
Yeah.
And I think these are the two best ones out there. These other ones, I think, are tenuous at best, because the text does not seem to be talking about that at all.
Yeah, and as a non-specialist, as a New Testament guy who's not a Genesis expert, I find both of them compelling. Like, I hear both of them, I'm like, yeah, that really makes a lot of sense.
Come on.
You have to choose,
right
Ron.
now, Ron.
Don't do it.
Can't do it.
Yes, you can.
Do it.
Come on, Ron. The readers want to know who's right, and you are the deciding vote.
Oh, I can't handle the pressure.
Well, then we'll just go with me then.
So I want to share a couple of more recent theories that I find humorous.
Please do.
One theory that I've read is that someone wrote an article, a Jewish scholar, where he suggests that the sons of God are Homo sapiens, which are the humans God created in Genesis 1-2. They appear in the fossil record around 100,000 years ago. The daughters of men, on the other hand, are Homo erectus, or Neanderthals.
Okay.
And the scientists placed them on the Earth beginning around 1.5 million years ago. And so you had these more intelligent humans
See, I have not heard that one.
who are more evolved species who are coming into contact with less evolved humans. And so when Neanderthals we think of as being, and the fossil record indicates they're bigger, they're taller. So when you have the tall humans mating with the shorter humans, then you get these hybrid humans that are taller than ordinary Homo sapiens.
So trying to bring in a little bit of, sort of archaeology and all that into it. Okay, I had not heard that one before. That's kind of an interesting theory.
What are your thoughts on that, Sam?
It has to be debunked because the world's only 6,000 years old.
Oh, well, there you go.
Oh, okay, yeah. Ken Ham.
Sorry to all of our Angels and Genesis people out there.
Yeah, for the young Earth people. So yeah, that's like I said, it's attempting to bring in sort of the modern fossil record. I don't know. I think that the downside to that argument in my own mind is would ancient Israelites have access to a story or write a story that addresses Neanderthals, I guess is what they're called now, interbreeding with modern humans. Yeah,
and again, for me, it goes back to terminology. Specific phrases and words are being used in this account.
Yeah.
And why would they use those words to talk about that situation that John just described? Yeah. I don't think they would. This is specific language being used, and I don't think just willy-nilly, that's a technical term, willy-nilly appropriating it like that is right.
Yeah.
So another theory, this is perhaps the most simple interpretation I've ever come across.
It's clever in its simplicity. No.
That the sons of God are males and the daughters of men are females.
Okay.
And the basis of this is that Genesis calls them this because the first male was made directly from God. So a son of God.
Sure.
And the first female and every female after that came from a man. And so daughters of men. Thus, all this account is really saying is when people took seriously the commission to be fruitful and multiply,
bad things happened.
They had children, and because they had children, they got into all sorts of trouble and filled the earth with violence.
So if they just wouldn't have had kids, everything would have been fine.
Except that they would have been neglecting God's command.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And no discussion of what or who the Nephilim are.
Yeah, that's the big weakness of this one.
It's a pretty important weakness.
Yeah.
Because that's what this story seems to be revolving around, but okay.
Yeah, there needs, to be, I think, a complete theory, you have to account for the language of son of God, the language of daughters of men, and the Nephilim. Mm-hmm. Like, what are they doing? Who are they? And how are they somehow connected to this reproduction? And this theory, as simple as it is and attractive as it might be, doesn't account for that. Right. So
overly simple.
Nice try.
Lacks explanatory power.
But I think we should move on. We kind of expose the audience to some theories about this obscure passage, and maybe you guys can vote on Facebook on which one you like better.
Yeah.
And then we'll let the masses decide.
Oh, yeah, because we can set up a Facebook poll so we can find out which theory the audience
gravitates toward. Yeah. Maybe not agrees with completely.
Yeah.
Because I got a lot more behind mine.
Yeah. I mean, we could all write full essays on the evidence behind the theories. Yeah. True that.
That would be kind of fun.
So, but you can give first impressions.
Yeah.
So moving forward, where's
right.
the account go from here? Sam, you got a Bible in your hand, so
correct.
You're the man.
So I kind of been disappointed in the NRSV because the phrase that begins 6:1 it's repeated in 6:5, but they don't bring it through as a repetition. So it says when people begin to multiply, but then here verse 5 says the Lord saw that wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and it's, if I'm not mistaken, the same phrase is also multiplying. So there's a parallelism there that doesn't come through. Anyway, so Yahweh looks out and sees the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. So it doesn't sound like God's really happy with what's going on, which we're not surprised about because we've already seen various things. And again, it's almost like if 1 through 4 were not even here, it makes sense based on what we just talked about in chapter 4, moving to chapter 5. And so then, this is a very startling phrase, and we don't have time to even come close to tackling this topic today. The Lord was sorry he had made humankind on the earth. That is a just in-your-face kind of phrase for people who focus on the sort of God who plans everything out explicitly and does not change in any way. But again, we don't have time for that.
Or
today.
a God who doesn't have feelings,
Or emotion,
doesn't
yeah.
have emotions, the unmoved mover who's
unmoved
unfazed
mover,
by everything, because to be phased, to be moved, would be to move away from perfection, to be toward non-perfection.
Yeah.
But this verse doesn't seem to be all that concerned to preserve the notion of unmoved mover.
Not really.
Yeah, I've never been able to buy into that whole idea that impassive God, the stoic, emotionless God. That Bible just doesn't reveal God that way. So it seems that. See, again, this is where I'm not the expert. That seems to come out of more of a Greco-Roman philosophical kind of an idea of unmoved mover than a truly biblically grounded ideal.
Yeah, certainly in this passage, and we'll see other passages, the Bible doesn't present God as someone who is unmoved.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think when John says in his gospel, Jesus wept, I think he does so for a reason. God actually is moved. Even when Jesus makes a decision that brings about people's grief. I mean, Jesus makes this decision to not act, basically to allow Lazarus to die when he could have spared his life. I mean, he could have stepped in. He got the information. He had time. Could have stepped in and didn't, allowed him to die. And then when he sees the effects of his decision upon the people, he's moved by that. Okay, God's not unmoved, even when God is the one who makes a decision that causes us to hurt. He cares about that. He made the decision for a reason, but yeah, I think he's moved.
Yeah. So there's a wider theology of God that, like Sam says, we probably don't have time to get
Not
into
even
that
close,
discussion. But
I had to say it. I mean, you can't just skip over it.
yeah, God is stricken with grief.
Yeah.
By the violence that's filled the earth, because the people he loves are dying left and right.
But I think the key thing to bring out is God created fully anticipating it to work. And God didn't create thinking, oh, they're all going to screw it up, I'm going to have to bring Jesus. I mean, that's an important thing to, I think, talk about, is that God created and expected it to work. And when it didn't, he was frustrated, sad, vexed, whatever, sorry that it had happened. And so I think we're talking about the story and how it's moving out, that's an important part of the story. That God, God had high expectations for us that we did not meet.
Yeah, we seem to have disappointed him at this point in the story.
Seems that way.
We seem to have disappointed God.
So it grieves him to his heart. And so the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I've created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I'm sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord.
Okay. And then next, what happened? I think we can just preview the whole account. The next big thing that happens, God floods the earth. Right?
Yeah. Spoiler.
God floods the earth. This is not news, but I think what I want to talk about is how we interpret this. Like, we know that the earth was so filled with violence that God chose to rid it altogether by flooding the earth.
Scrub it clean.
And this allows for a clean slate. And one of the big challenges, I think, when people read this passage today is how could a God who is loving do something so horrifying? Especially if they've seen the Noah movie. It's nice to think about the ark with the animals and the colors and the flannel graph and everyone smiling on the ark.
The baby's bedroom with the Noah theme in it, all the animals in the ark all happy and everything.
Yeah, but for that to happen, there had to be all the other families of the earth that are like gasping for their last breath.
Yeah.
That's what I was wondering.
Drowning.
Should we sneak into babies' rooms and draw little people with their
I know,
hands
right? That's
scratching it. Oh, no. Poor children. They don't notice. They're too small.
Because, I mean, I see that all the time. I've seen, like, babies' bedrooms decorated in Noah's Ark theme. And it's this very happy scene of Noah and the animals and everything. And in fact, we were at a conference. It was an SCJ conference a few years back where one of the speakers talked about the transition in the way the flood story was told. That you go back just a few hundred years, the flood story was told in such a way is that it emphasized the scrubbing of the earth of all the wicked people. And that even children were told that. And it was in the context of this shift of how adults view children. At one point, children were viewed as these inherently wicked people who needed to be scared into being better people. Now, modern people view little children, as innocents who need to be protected and their innocence preserved. And he cited this as an example of this transition of viewing children children were once told, hey, the flood killed all the bad people, don't let this happen to you, so to speak. Now where it's like, oh, look at how God saved all the animals from the flood, and expunged from the story this whole idea of people grabbing at the side of their ark trying to crawl onto it because they're about to drown and die and become fish food.
Well, I think there's an easy reason for that. It's because I don't think people know how to explain it.
Yeah.
How do you explain to someone why this loving God of creation would kill a bunch of people and only save some?
Yeah. And you'll be happy to know that the Ark encounter
Oh, boy.
emphasizes the death and destruction.
Yeah.
So, does that make you feel better, Ron?
It does a little bit, yeah. Actually, it does a little bit. But
Yeah,
probably
I was really surprised at just how much. I mean, at the Ark Encounter, this is that museum down in
Creation Museum.
Is near the Creation Museum,
Right. They're same.
All right, two different
People.
playgrounds,
Right.
Same people, yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was surprised when I went there that there's so much. I mean, it's like a big evangelistic pitch. You go
Yes.
through it, and you get toward the end, and it's just like, and look at all the bad things that happened to all the bad people. Therefore, you need Jesus. I was surprised how little emphasis in the whole Ark Encounter was placed on the rainbow. Like the promise at the end, I don't know. I didn't notice it anywhere. I'm sure it was somewhere, but it was such a minor theme. I thought that would be like the culmination of the Ark Encounter was the rainbow. Like I just thought there'd be a big rainbow to do at the end. Instead, they ended it with, "Don't let this happen to you. This is what human wickedness is." And then they listed all the modern professional sins that conservative evangelicals like to rail against today and warn people not to be like the flood generation.
Like gluttony.
Yeah, like gluttony and greed. No,
Greed.
No.
Yeah. Hoarding of resources to yourself and to the neglect of your neighbors.
But I think you're right, Sam. I think, what do you do with this? How do you reconcile a God that uses his great power to lead to the death of so many people? How do you guys reconcile it? Where do you go?
I mean, there's nothing for me to reconcile because the theme of judgment permeates the Bible. I mean, what's to reconcile? The Bible's all about God's judgment. I mean, it happens over and over and over again. And so I don't understand what is lacking to be reconciled there. Now, John, I think you made a really, really important point, is there's the rainbow at the end. I think that's a key component of the story, that, God does bring judgment. And from our point of view, it seems pretty harsh. He just wiped out who knows how many thousands of people. But there is this ending at the end where God says, I've done this. I'm never going to do this again. God's trying to right the problem here. He created a good earth that human beings are totally screwing up. And he's like, this is not the way this is supposed to work. So let's see if we can purge all the bad ones, start fresh with this is just Ron speaking, a fresh Adam, so to speak, in Noah and his family who demonstrate righteousness. Let's see if we can start out fresh now with this righteous family and correct this horrible thing that's been going on the earth that's manifesting itself in violence and, abuse, and see if we can right this boat, so to speak. And, obviously the message is that sin is so endemic that even righteous people carry this sort of seed that's going to be passed on.
So for you, the flood is not really an exception in the Bible story, as it's one of those themes that's persistent throughout. Maybe it just looms large here, but it looms large in other places too.
Yeah, it manifests itself in different ways, but yeah, I mean, judgment is a consistent theme in the Bible. But if all we focus in on judgment, then yeah, that's going to seem kind of harsh to us. One of the themes that looms large in the Bible also is restoration, renewal, creating space for forgiveness, a God who brings judgment, but who creates this great space before judgment for there to be forgiveness and reconciliation, a God who's driving toward restoration, driving toward renewal. And then part of, I think that's, at least for me, again, speaking as a New Testament guy, not an Old Testament guy, but part of the story of the flood is in many ways, I think, meant to subvert what might be a human approach, and that is, hey, if we just sort of scrub the earth clean of the really bad people and get the good people populating the earth, then we can renew the earth and get back to God's design. And part of the story of the flood is to say, yep, tried that, didn't work. That the renewal that needs to happen is something that is far more complete than just sort of scrubbing away the bad, and starting out with like this sort of righteous remnant. That's not a solution.
I think part of the issue people have with that is the judgment of the rest of the Bible is a judgment upon the wicked. And in the flood, there seemed to be so many innocent people, like all the children, all the babies, at least, right? The flood is so comprehensive that it's not God going through and separating the sheep from the goats and drowning the goats. It's God's flooding everyone but a family. So there's a lot of innocent bloodshed here that feels like it's hard to reconcile. It feels different than the other ones.
I get that. I can understand why a person would respond in that way. I guess as I think about it, I see a God who sees a much bigger picture than that. There's a sense in which we only see from this side of death. We see the life we have on this earth, and we place tremendous value on that, and understandably so. That what comes after death to us really isn't part of the equation. And I think from God's perspective, he sees a much bigger picture where death is not the end the way we think of death as the end. We think of death as being this horrible, tragic thing, which on the one hand it is. Paul says it's the last enemy to be defeated. But God just has a bigger overarching view of things to where he says, from my perspective, this isn't what you think it is. No, that's part of how I reconcile it in my own mind. Whether that's compelling or has explanatory power for others.
I'm looking at Sam, and he's shaking me off and pointing to his watch. I think we're going to have to leave this on a cliffhanger because I'm not satisfied yet with that explanation.
That's fine.
I think it's part of an answer, and but I think we need to be able to say more.
I'm done with that.
But we're going to have to wait till the next episode.
We will. Our fans and our listeners will as well.
They will expect more.
Yes.
All right.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class.